A freezing puppy scratches desperately at a man's door, shivering and weak. At first, he hesitates. He's not the kind of man to take in strays. But something about the dog's pleading eyes makes him stop. The moment he lets the puppy in, his entire world comes crashing down. Because what happens next is something he never saw coming. What is this puppy's real story? And why does it bring him to tears? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind howled through the streets of downtown as Detective Adrian Cole slumped in his worn leather chair. Empty coffee cups littered his desk, casualties of another late night poring over case files. The lamp cast long shadows across photos of shattered display cases and empty jewelry boxes, all that remained of the city's latest string of high-profile heists. Adrian rubbed his tired eyes. 6 burglaries in 2 months, and they were no closer to catching the perpetrators. Each crime scene was pristine, professional. Too professional. The only lead they had was a scrap of torn fabric from that morning's jewelry store job, and that wasn't much to go on. Outside his third-floor apartment window, snow pelted against the glass like tiny bullets. The storm had turned the city into a ghost town, with even the most determined souls seeking shelter from the bitter cold. Adrian preferred it this way. Quiet, isolated. It was easier to think without distractions. He was about to call it a night when he heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from his front door. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but there it was again, more insistent this time. With a weary sigh, Adrian pushed himself up from his chair. His hand instinctively moved to the holster at his hip as he approached the door. Years on the force had taught him to expect the unexpected. When he opened the door, he found himself staring down at a massive German shepherd. The dog was soaked to the bone, its dark fur matted with mud and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Despite its rough appearance, the animal's eyes were alert and intelligent, fixed intently on Adrian's face. "Great," Adrian muttered. "Just what I need." He started to close the door, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the dog looked at him, or maybe he was just too tired to be heartless. Whatever the reason, he found himself stepping aside to let the animal in. The dog limped past him, leaving wet paw prints on the hardwood floor. Adrian grabbed an old towel from the bathroom and approached carefully. "Easy there, big guy," he said, wrapping the towel around the shivering animal. As he dried the dog off, his fingers brushed against something attached to its collar. A strip of fabric, dark and wet, with what he now confirmed was blood. Adrian's heart rate quickened as he carefully untied it. Even in the dim light, he recognized it immediately. The material, the distinctive pattern. It matched perfectly with the torn sleeve they'd found at the jewelry store that morning. This wasn't just some stray. This dog had been there. The German shepherd watched him intently, as if waiting for Adrian to make the connection. Once he had, the dog moved to the door, whining softly and pawing at the frame. "You want me to follow you, is that it?" Adrian asked. The dog's ears perked up at his words. Adrian looked at the clock, almost midnight, then back at the dog. There was something about this animal, something that told him this wasn't a coincidence. In his line of work, he'd learned to trust his gut. "All right then," he said, reaching for his coat. "If we're going to work together, you need a name." He studied the dog's determined stance, its watchful eyes. "Hunter," he decided. "That fits." Adrian checked his gun, grabbed his badge, and knelt in front of his new companion. "All right, Hunter," he muttered. "Show me what you know." The bitter wind cut through Adrian's coat like razor blades as he stepped out into the storm. Snow swirled around them in angry white clouds, already beginning to erase Hunter's earlier tracks. The streetlights cast eerie yellow circles in the darkness, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. Hunter paused at the bottom of the apartment steps, nose lifted to the frigid air. His ears twitched forward, and without warning, he took off down the empty street. Adrian cursed under his breath, breaking into a jog to keep up with the determined animal. "This is crazy," he muttered, his words lost in the howling wind. The city felt abandoned, with only the occasional glow of windows high above suggesting any sign of life. His feet crunched through fresh snow as Hunter led him deeper into the maze of urban streets. They wound through narrow alleyways, past darkened shops with their metal shutters pulled down tight. The neighborhood grew steadily worse. Graffiti-covered walls, overflowing dumpsters, broken bottles crunching beneath Adrian's boots. The kind of place where people minded their own business and kept their doors locked at night. Hunter moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to ensure Adrian was still following. Despite the absurdity of the situation, a veteran detective following a stray dog through a blizzard in the middle of the night, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than random chance. The fabric on Hunter's collar was proof enough that the dog knew something about the case. After what felt like miles, Hunter slowed his pace. They emerged from an alley into an industrial area, where abandoned warehouses loomed like sleeping giants in the darkness. The dog led them to one particular building, its facade a patchwork of broken windows and crumbling brick. Adrian's police instincts kicked in as he surveyed the structure. The main entrance was partially open, its heavy metal door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Fresh snow had drifted inside, but there were signs of recent activity, scuffed footprints in the thin layer of white, a displaced piece of plywood that had once covered a window. Drawing his weapon, Adrian felt his heart rate increase. Years of experience told him they weren't alone. The warehouse felt alive somehow, holding its secrets in the darkness beyond that door. He took a careful step toward the entrance, his shoes crunching softly in the snow. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, Hunter's demeanor changed. The dog's hackles rose, and a low warning growl rumbled in his throat. Adrian froze, every muscle tensing. In the absolute silence that followed, he heard it, the unmistakable creak of weight on old floorboards coming from somewhere above them. His breath came out in visible puffs as he tightened his grip on his gun. "Stay close, Hunter," he whispered, before stepping into the unknown. The warehouse air hit them like a wall of decay. Musty wood, mildew, and something else Adrian couldn't quite place. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing a scene of recent activity that couldn't be more than an hour old. Empty food cans lay scattered across a folding table, their contents barely touched, some still glistening with sauce. A metal chair lay on its side, its legs pointing accusingly toward the door, as if someone had left in a hurry. In an old ceramic ashtray, decorated with faded flowers, a cigarette still released thin wisps of smoke into the stale air, its ember refusing to die. Hunter padded silently across the concrete floor, his nails clicking softly with each step, like tiny Morse code signals in the darkness. The dog's nose worked overtime, taking in every scent, his head bobbing up and down until he stopped near a collection of weathered wooden crates. A low whine escaped his throat as he pawed at the floor, his entire body trembling with urgency. Adrian approached cautiously, each step measured and deliberate, his flashlight beam revealing subtle marks in the dust. Someone had moved these crates recently, leaving telltale streaks in the thick gray coating. Kneeling down, he ran his fingers along the floor until he felt it, a slight gap between the boards, barely wider than a credit card. With careful pressure, a section of flooring lifted away with a soft groan, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. The beam of his flashlight illuminated several bundles of cash, rubber-banded together and still carrying the distinct smell of fresh ink, sharp and chemical. Beside them lay a handgun, its serial number crudely scratched away with what looked like a file, leaving ugly gouges in the metal. But what caught Adrian's attention was a partially burned piece of paper, its edges black and crumbling like dead leaves. Written in hasty strokes were the words, "Midnight. The Shack." The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, as if the writer had been in a desperate hurry. Before he could fully process the significance of the note, Hunter's body language changed dramatically. The dog's ears shot up, his tail becoming rigid as a rod, every muscle in his body tensing for action. The soft crunch of footsteps in snow drifted in through the broken windows, each step bringing whoever it was closer to their position. Adrian quickly pocketed the note and pressed a finger to his lips. Though Hunter seemed to understand the need for silence without the gesture, his dark eyes fixed intently on his human partner. Moving carefully to avoid any noise, Adrian edged toward one of the broken windows, his boots finding silent purchase on the debris-strewn floor. Through a jagged gap in the glass, he could make out a dark figure standing motionless in the shadows, eyes fixed on the warehouse, barely visible except for the occasional glint of streetlight on what might have been a weapon. Pulling his gun from its holster with practiced ease, Adrian felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. "Let's see who's following us," he whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air as he prepared to slip into the night. Hunter pressed close to his leg, ready to move as one with his partner. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a deceptive silence that made every footstep seem thunderous. Adrian moved like a shadow along the warehouse wall, his boots finding purchase in the fresh powder. Hunter matched his movements perfectly, staying close enough that Adrian could feel the warmth radiating from the dog's body. The figure by the dumpster shifted restlessly, the ember of his cigarette painting brief circles of orange light in the darkness. The street light above flickered erratically, and in those brief moments of illumination, Adrian caught glimpses of a familiar face. Mickey Reynolds stood there, shoulders hunched against the cold, his thin jacket doing little to ward off the winter chill. Adrian stepped out of the shadows, his gun steady in his hands. "You lost, Mickey?" The cigarette tumbled from Mickey's fingers as he jumped, hands shooting up instinctively. "Damn it, Cole! You trying to give me a heart attack?" His voice cracked, eyes wide with genuine fear. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Adrian kept his tone casual, but his grip on the gun never wavered. "Kind of far from your usual haunts." Mickey's gaze darted between Adrian and Hunter, who stood silently at attention, dark eyes fixed on the informant. Sweat beaded on Mickey's forehead despite the cold. "Look, man, I don't know nothing. I heard some guys talking about a job going down. Something big. Real big." His words came out in rushed bursts, like he couldn't get them out fast enough. Adrian reached into his pocket with his free hand, pulling out the half-burnt note. The paper seemed to glow faintly in the weak light. "Midnight. The Shack. What's this about?" The color drained from Mickey's face so quickly it was visible, even in the poor lighting. "Jesus, Cole! You don't want to go there. Not alone." His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, as if afraid someone might overhear. Hunter let out a low growl, the sound rumbling through the quiet alley. Adrian stepped closer, close enough to smell the cheap cigarettes on Mickey's breath. "Then tell me why." His voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the words. Mickey licked his lips nervously, his eyes darting to the shadows around them, before he muttered, "Because if you do, you're going to end up just as dead as the last guy who tried." Adrian exhaled slowly, tucking the note back into his pocket. Midnight was coming fast, and now there was no turning back. The snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the abandoned fishing shack that sat like a dark smudge against the white landscape. Adrian's car was parked across from it, hidden in the shadows of overgrown trees. The dashboard clock glowed 11:48 p.m., its red numbers a stark reminder that time was ticking down to midnight. Hunter sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, his ears forward and alert, dark eyes fixed on the shack. His presence was oddly comforting in the tense silence. Steam rose from his slightly open mouth as he breathed, fogging up a small circle on the window. Adrian lifted his binoculars, methodically scanning the area around the shack. The building looked deserted, its weathered boards and broken windows revealing nothing but darkness inside. No footprints marked the fresh snow. No shadows moved behind the windows. No guards patrolled the perimeter. The stillness felt wrong, setting off warning bells in Adrian's mind. Either Mickey had fed him bad information, or whoever was meeting here knew how to stay invisible. At 11:55 p.m., a pair of headlights pierced through the snowfall, cutting yellow beams through the darkness. Adrian lowered his binoculars, watching as a black SUV rolled quietly down the narrow road, its tires crunching over fresh snow. The vehicle came to a smooth stop in front of the shack, its engine purring softly. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out into the swirling snow. Even in the dim light, Adrian recognized the confident stride, the expensive coat, the way he carried himself like he owned everything his eyes fell upon. Danny Russo. The man Adrian had been trying to nail for months stood less than 50 yards away. Adrian's hands tightened around the binoculars until his knuckles turned white. Finally, after all this time, he had the bastard in his sights. The passenger door of the SUV opened and another figure emerged. The sight hit Adrian like a physical blow. The uniform was unmistakable. The dark blue fabric, the badge catching what little light there was. A police officer. One of his own. Adrian's stomach twisted into a cold knot. The implications crashed over him like an icy wave. This wasn't just about catching a thief anymore. This was about corruption in his own department. The realization made his mouth go dry. He couldn't trust anyone. Not his fellow officers, not his superiors. Maybe not even the system he'd sworn to uphold. Beside him, Hunter let out a low growl, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Adrian's hands moved from the binoculars to grip the steering wheel, his fingers finding the familiar worn leather. The cold that seeped into his bones had nothing to do with the winter night outside. Through his binoculars, Adrian watched as Russo and the uniformed officer met in front of the shack. Snow swirled around them, their breath visible in the cold air. The officer carried a sleek black briefcase, holding it with both hands, like it contained something precious. Russo nodded, and the officer set the case on the hood of the SUV. The metallic click of the latches seemed to echo in the silent night. When the lid lifted, Adrian's breath caught in his throat. Stacks of crisp bills filled the case, neat rows of blood money laid out under the SUV's headlights. Adrian's mind raced. What was this payment for? Information about ongoing investigations? Silence about past crimes? Whatever it was, this scene playing out before him was the smoking gun he'd been searching for. Proof of corruption that could bring down Russo's entire operation. Moving slowly, Adrian reached for his phone. His cold fingers fumbled with the device as he tried to position it for a clear shot through the windshield. Just one photo. That's all he needed. Suddenly, Hunter let out a sharp, explosive bark that shattered the night stillness. The sound seemed to hang in the frozen air for a terrible moment. Russo and the officer went rigid. Then, like a snake spotting its prey, Russo's head snapped toward Adrian's car, his eyes cutting through the darkness with terrifying precision. "Go!" Adrian shouted, throwing the car into reverse. The engine roared as he stomped on the gas. Gunshots cracked through the night, sharp and deadly. The windshield exploded inward, sending a shower of glass across the dashboard. Adrian ducked low over the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tires struggled for grip as he swung the car around on the icy road. Behind them, the SUV's engine thundered to life, headlights blazing as it gave chase. Hunter barked frantically from the passenger seat, his powerful body braced against the violent movement of the car. Adrian's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as the car fishtailed across the frozen asphalt. More shots rang out, pinging off the trunk. The rearview mirror showed the SUV gaining on them, its massive front grille filling the frame. Through the chaos of squealing tires and gunfire, Adrian's training kicked in. He needed to end this chase before they got to populated areas, before innocent people got hurt. Spotting a sharp turn ahead, Adrian made his move. He waited until the last possible moment, then slammed on the brakes. His car skidded, but held the road. The SUV, moving too fast to react, overshot the turn completely. The massive vehicle hit the guardrail with a thunderous crash of metal on metal. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings as Adrian floored the accelerator, his car shooting forward into the darkness. His breath came in ragged gas as they sped away, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Beside him, Hunter panted heavily, his eyes fixed intently on the road ahead. They'd survived, but everything had changed. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. They weren't just hunting Russo and his corrupt cops. Now, Russo was hunting them. Adrian's car limped into the underground parking garage, the shattered windshield letting in the bitter cold. He pulled into a dark corner spot and cut the engine, plunging them into silence. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white from the tension. Beside him, Hunter whined softly, picking up on his anxiety. "I know, boy," Adrian muttered, running a shaky hand through his hair. "We need a plan." He pulled out the half-burnt note from his pocket, studying the hastily scrawled writing. Next to it, he placed his phone, scrolling through the blurry photos he'd managed to take. In the dim light of the garage, he could barely make out Russo's silhouette and the officer's uniform. It wasn't enough. Nothing concrete. Nothing that would hold up. But that cop. Adrian's mind raced. A uniformed officer taking bribes from Russo himself. This wasn't some low-level corruption. This was big. If he could identify the officer, maybe he could apply pressure. Everyone had a weakness, something that would make them talk. The trick was finding it before Russo found them. Adrian glanced at his rearview mirror, checking the empty garage for the 100th time. His apartment wasn't safe anymore. Oh, if Russo had made him at the shack, that would be the first place they'd look. He needed somewhere off the grid, somewhere to think and plan his next move. The answer came to him like a forgotten memory. The cabin. It was an old witness protection safe house from a case years ago, tucked away in the woods outside the city. The program had abandoned it after budget cuts, but Adrian had kept track of it, just in case. As far as he knew, no one else remembered it existed. He started the car again, the engine's rumble echoing off the concrete walls. Hunter sat up straighter, alert and ready. They wound their way through the city's outskirts, taking back roads and checking constantly for tails. The snow had picked up again, creating a white curtain that helped hide their escape. The cabin appeared as a dark shape among the trees, small and unassuming. Adrian parked behind it, out of sight from the narrow access road. The wind howled through the bare branches as he and Hunter made their way to the front door. His frozen fingers fumbled with the old key he'd kept all these years, finally managing to work it into the lock. The door creaked open into darkness. Adrian stepped inside, securing the lock behind them. He let out a long breath, shoulders sagging with temporary relief. They had time now. Time to think, to plan their next. Hunter's body suddenly went rigid beside him. His ears perked forward and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Adrian's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Adrian's gun swept through the darkness, his finger steady on the trigger as sweat beaded on his forehead. Hunter's growl deepened beside him, the sound vibrating through the worn floorboards like distant thunder. They moved as one through the dimly lit cabin, each step careful and measured, years of training evident in their synchronized movements. The beam of Adrian's flashlight cut through the heavy shadows, revealing empty rooms and dusty furniture covered in sheets that looked like pale ghosts in the darkness. A floorboard creaked near the kitchen, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. "Easy, detective." The voice was familiar, casual almost, with an underlying note of amusement. Adrian's hand found the light switch, flicking it with practiced precision. Light flooded the cabin's interior, revealing Mickey Reynolds standing in the kitchen, his hands raised in surrender, a crooked smile playing on his lips. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter in front of him, like he'd made himself right at home, crumbs scattered across the worn formica surface. Adrian's jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't put you in cuffs right now." Mickey, looking oddly relaxed for someone staring down the barrel of a gun, picked up his sandwich and took another deliberate bite. He chewed slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world, his eyes never leaving Adrian's face. "Look, man, I know what you saw tonight, and I know you got questions." He brushed crumbs from his wrinkled shirt with exaggerated care. "Lucky for you, I got answers, the kind that might keep you breathing." Adrian's eyes narrowed to slits, but he kept his gun trained steadily on Mickey. Hunter stayed pressed against his leg, muscles coiled and tense, ready to spring at the slightest signal from his partner. Mickey leaned forward across the counter, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, his expression suddenly grave. "You're not the only cop Russo's got in his pocket, not by a long shot." The words hit Adrian like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily breathless. He'd suspected corruption in the department. The evidence had been there for months, piling up like dead leaves. Little things, cases that disappeared into thin air, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories overnight. But hearing it confirmed made his stomach twist into knots. Mickey sighed heavily, pushing his plate away with one finger. "They're gonna come after you, Cole. They know you were there tonight." He glanced at his watch, the face scratched and dirty. "You got maybe 12 hours before someone finds you, if you're lucky." A cold wave of realization washed over Adrian, chilling him to the bone. Russo wasn't going to wait for him to gather evidence or build a case. The game had changed dramatically the moment Adrian's cover was blown at the shack. Hunter's ears suddenly perked up, his attention shifting sharply to the door, body going rigid. In the heavy quiet of the night, the sound of a car engine rumbling to life cut through the darkness like a knife. They'd been found, and time had just run out. The air in the cabin crackled with tension as the car engine outside rumbled to a stop, the sound of crunching snow beneath heavy boots following close behind. Adrian's muscles tensed, his fingers tightening around his gun until his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Hunter's ears twitched and rotated like radar dishes, picking up sounds too faint for human ears. The German shepherd's body went rigid, his tail straight as a rod, a silent alarm that spoke volumes to his partner. Mickey pressed himself against the kitchen wall, his earlier bravado replaced by naked fear, sweat beading on his forehead despite the winter chill. "Cole," he whispered, voice trembling like autumn leaves. "What's the play here?" Adrian raised a finger to his lips, moving swiftly to kill the cabin lights with practiced precision. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the snow-covered windows, casting an ethereal blue glow across the room. Through the thin curtains, Adrian could make out 3 dark figures trudging through the knee-deep snow, their weapons clearly visible in the dim light as they fanned out around the cabin's perimeter. "Back!" Adrian mouthed to Mickey, gesturing toward the rear of the cabin where shadows offered better cover. They weren't here to talk. Their drawn weapons and tactical approach made that clear enough to anyone with half a brain. A bright beam of light swept across the window, like a searching eye, casting long shadows across the cabin's worn wooden floor. Hunter's warning growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that made the hair on Adrian's neck stand up, and his cop instinct screamed danger. The silence shattered like glass as a gunshot roared through the night, echoing off the surrounding mountains. The front window exploded inward with a devastating crash, sending deadly shards of glass flying across the room like crystalline shrapnel. Adrian lunged forward with lightning speed, tackling Mickey to the floor as another bullet punched through the wooden walls with a sharp crack, embedding itself in the far wall with a dull thud. Hunter bolted toward the back door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors like nature's Morse code. Adrian's mind raced through their limited options. They were pinned down, outgunned, with no backup to call, and nowhere to run, but into the raging blizzard. His hand brushed against his duffel bag, and he remembered the flashbang grenade from an old raid case, still in its tactical pouch. He'd kept it, against regulations, telling himself it might come in handy someday. Looks like someday was today, and he'd never been more grateful for breaking protocol. Adrian pulled the grenade from the bag, its weight familiar in his palm like an old friend. He met Mickey's wide-eyed stare and nodded once, a silent promise of protection. Taking a deep breath that steadied his nerves, he pulled the pin and hurled it through the broken window with perfect aim. The flash was blinding even from inside the cabin, the bang so loud it felt like a physical force hammering against their bodies. Outside, their attackers screamed in confusion and pain, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos. Adrian didn't waste a second of their advantage. He grabbed Mickey's arm and ran for the back door where Hunter waited, tail low and alert, all 3 of them disappearing into the howling storm that would cover their tracks and mask their escape. The snow had finally let up, but darkness still cloaked the city as Adrian's car cut through the empty streets. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, mind churning over the attack at the cabin. The precision, the timing, it wasn't random. Russo's men had known exactly where to find them. In the passenger seat, Mickey huddled deeper into his coat, his teeth chattering from more than just the cold. "I told you, man. The whole department's dirty." He glanced nervously at the rearview mirror for the 100th time. "You need to figure out who's feeding him information." Adrian's jaw clenched. Mickey was right. Someone had to be Russo's eyes and ears inside the force. Someone who knew enough to track them to the cabin. The thought made his stomach turn. Betrayal from within hurt worse than any bullet. The car's headlights swept across an empty parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall. Adrian pulled in, killing the engine, but leaving the heat running for Mickey's sake. In the back seat, Hunter sat alert, his intelligent eyes fixed on Adrian as he retrieved his laptop from his go bag. The screen's blue glow illuminated the car's interior as Adrian's fingers flew across the keyboard. He pulled up recent patrol logs, cross-referencing them with cases linked to Russo's operation. Hunter's tail twitched back and forth as if sensing Adrian's growing tension. A pattern emerged. One name kept appearing: Detective Marcus Kane. Adrian's breath caught. Kane was a veteran cop, respected throughout the department. His record was spotless, too spotless now that Adrian looked closer. The pieces started falling into place like a grim puzzle. Kane had been first on scene at 3 separate heists linked to Russo's crew. Security footage that could have identified Russo's men had mysteriously disappeared while in Kane's custody. Adrian dug deeper, accessing financial records that should have been confidential. There it was, large deposits into Kane's account over the past 2 months, carefully spaced to avoid suspicion, but clear as day to someone who knew where to look. Mickey leaned over, squinting at the screen. Kane? Man, I always thought he was one of the good ones. That's exactly why Russo picked him, Adrian muttered, scrolling through more damning evidence. Who would suspect the department's golden boy? The truth sat heavy in Adrian's chest. Kane wasn't just dirty. He was Russo's perfect mole. A respected detective whose word would always carry more weight than Adrian's suspicions. Adrian slammed the laptop shut, the sound making Mickey jump. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold car. Kane wouldn't talk willingly. Men like him never did. Adrian needed leverage, something concrete enough to make Kane choose between loyalty to Russo and saving his own skin. And Adrian knew exactly where to find it. Hours later, the falling snow muffled all sound as Adrian's car rolled to a stop across from Kane's house. He cut the engine, studying the darkened 2-story home through the drifting flakes. The street was deserted at this hour, the only movement coming from the lazy descent of snowflakes caught in the amber glow of streetlights. The weathered brick facade loomed before him, its windows like dark, unseeing eyes staring back into the night. In the passenger seat, Hunter's ears twitched forward, his eyes locked on the house with an unsettling intensity. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, barely audible. Adrian had seen that look before, the same focused stare that had led them to the warehouse. The dog's instincts hadn't been wrong yet, and Adrian had learned to trust them more than he trusted most humans. Adrian drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, considering his options. His breath fogged the cold window as he weighed the risks. Kane was dangerous, more dangerous than most people realized. A direct confrontation would end badly, probably with one of them dead. No, he needed to be smarter. He needed evidence that would stick. Checking his watch for the 3rd time, Adrian grabbed his lock-picking tools from the glove compartment. The metal felt cold against his palm. Kane was supposed to be working the night shift. Adrian had triple-checked the rotation schedule. This was his chance to do what he did best, dig up dirt that others had tried to bury. The lock on Kane's back door gave way after less than a minute of careful manipulation, the tumblers falling into place with a satisfying click. Adrian slipped inside, Hunter following silently at his heels, their footsteps whisper quiet on the hardwood floors. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional settling creak of old wood. Moving quickly but methodically, Adrian made his way to Kane's home office, his flashlight beam carefully contained. The room was meticulously organized, too organized, like someone with something to hide. Every paper was perfectly aligned, every book precisely placed. Adrian started his search, careful to return everything exactly as he found it, photographing each item's position before moving it. The evidence mounted quickly. Burner phones stashed in a false-bottom drawer, bundles of cash hidden behind books, documents detailing police operations with certain sections highlighted in precise yellow strokes. But the real prize was a USB drive tucked inside an old case file, labeled with nothing but a date from 3 years ago. Oh, Adrian's hands were steady as he plugged the drive into his laptop, years of experience keeping his movements controlled despite his racing heart. His breath caught as he scanned through the files, each one more damning than the last. There it was, surveillance footage showing Cain and Russo meeting in empty parking lots, dark alleys, abandoned buildings. Audio recordings of Cain feeding sensitive police information directly to Russo, his voice unmistakable. Financial records documenting bribes to at least 4 other officers in the department, each payment carefully coded but clearly traceable. This wasn't just evidence of Cain's corruption. This was proof of systemic rot within the force. The kind of evidence that could bring down Russo's entire operation, the smoking gun Adrian had spent years searching for. The sound of tires crunching on snow cut through the silence like a knife. Hunter's ears shot up, his body going rigid as he stared at the window. Adrian's heart jumped into his throat as headlights swept across the office window, casting long shadows across the wall. He yanked the USB drive free and shoved it deep into his pocket, his mind racing through escape routes and contingency plans. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the quiet street, followed by measured footsteps on the front walk. The front door creaked open with agonizing slowness. Detective Marcus Cain stepped inside, his service weapon already drawn and pointed straight ahead, his face set in a grim mask that told Adrian everything he needed to know about what was about to happen. The tension in Cain's office crackled like static electricity, thick enough to choke on. Cain's eyes were hard and cold as winter ice as they locked onto Adrian, his service weapon unwavering in his white-knuckled grip. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the room's chill. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me why the hell you're in my house," he growled, his voice low and dangerous, each word dripping with barely contained rage. Hunter's response was immediate and fierce. The German shepherd's lips pulled back, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light, his powerful muscles tensed and ready to spring. The dog's threatening growl filled the small space between them, echoing off the wood-paneled walls like distant thunder. Adrian slowly raised his hands, keeping his movements deliberate and calm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You and I both know what's on that USB," he said evenly, watching Cain's face for any reaction, any tell that might give him an advantage. There it was, a brief flicker across Cain's features, something that might have been fear or guilt, but it vanished so quickly Adrian almost missed it. Cain's expression hardened again, like cement setting. "Hand it over," he ordered, adjusting his grip on the gun with trembling fingers. Adrian let out a slow breath, his mind racing through options like shuffling cards. "You don't want to do this?" Cain's trigger finger twitched slightly, betraying his nervousness despite his tough exterior. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "You have no idea how deep this goes, Cole." "Then tell me," Adrian pressed, his voice steady and reasonable, like talking down a cornered animal. "Give me Russo, and I can protect you." A bitter laugh escaped Cain's throat, sharp and humorless, echoing in the tense atmosphere. "Protect me? You don't get it, do you? I'm not the only cop he owns. You turn me in, you're a dead man walking." Adrian took a careful step forward, ignoring the way Cain's gun followed his movement, the barrel trembling almost imperceptibly. "Then make it worth my while." The office fell into heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the heating system. Cain's jaw worked back and forth as he processed Adrian's words, the muscles in his face twitching with internal struggle. The only sound was Hunter's continuous, low growl and the soft whisper of snow against the windows outside, nature's gentle counterpoint to the violence brewing within. Finally, Cain lowered his weapon, his shoulders sagging slightly as if an invisible weight had settled upon them. He glared at Adrian with a mixture of resignation and anger, his face pale in the dim light. "Fine," he spat out, the word bitter on his tongue. "But if I do this, we do it my way." Adrian gave a single, firm nod, his expression grave. The rules of engagement had just shifted dramatically, and they both knew there would be no turning back from what came next. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly in the parking garage, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. A faint electrical buzz echoed through the empty space, accompanied by the steady drip of melting snow from car bumpers. Adrian and Kane sat in their cars, facing each other through open windows, the engines idling to keep warm in the biting cold. Hunter lay vigilant at Adrian's feet in the footwell, his amber eyes fixed on Kane with unwavering intensity, his muscles tense and ready. Kane looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes as he rubbed his temples with trembling fingers. His normally pristine suit was wrinkled, tie loosened as if he'd been tugging at it nervously all day. The weight of his decision seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Finally, he broke the tense silence, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "Russo isn't just some street thug," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper, glancing over his shoulder. "He's got people everywhere, cops, lawyers, even a judge or two. The whole system's rotten to the core." Adrian's expression remained stone cold, unmoved by the revelation. His jaw clenched slightly, the only indication that he was processing this information. "I need names." Kane's eyes darted around the empty garage, as if expecting shadows to come alive and strike him down for what he was about to do. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, creating small clouds in the frigid air. With shaking hands, he pulled out a burner phone from his jacket pocket. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through messages, each swipe of his thumb seeming to cost him something, each moment of hesitation speaking volumes about his fear. After what felt like an eternity, Kane extended his arm, holding out the phone like it was a live grenade. "This is Russo's next job. A major drop. Tonight." His hand trembled so badly he nearly dropped the device. Adrian took the phone, his eyes scanning the message displayed on the screen. Dock 17, 2 a.m. His mind raced through the possibilities, years of experience connecting the dots. The location, the timing. It could be anything from drug trafficking to money laundering or even weapons smuggling. But one thing was certain. Russo would be there, orchestrating his empire from the shadows. Kane shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, rolling down his temples. "I'll help you, Cole," he said, his voice cracking slightly, raw with desperation. "But you need to promise me something." Adrian's gaze sharpened, his eyes boring into Kane, reading every micro-expression. "What?" "Make sure I live through this." The words came out in a rush, heavy with the weight of a man who knew too much. Adrian's face remained impassive as he slipped the burner phone into his pocket. The device felt heavy against his chest, laden with possibilities and dangers. "Depends on how useful you are." At his feet, Hunter let out a soft growl, as if underlining the threat in Adrian's words. His hackles raised slightly, sensing the tension in the air. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m. Time was running out, and the night was about to get very interesting. The bitter wind whipped across the rooftop as Adrian lay prone, his rifle scope trained on Dock 17. The night air carried the sharp scent of salt and diesel fuel from the harbor below, mingling with the metallic tang of his weapon. Through his scope, he watched the maze of cargo containers casting long shadows under the harsh dock lights, their steel surfaces reflecting the pale glow like mirrors in the darkness. A single black SUV sat parked near the water's edge, its windows tinted pitch black, gleaming menacingly in the artificial light. Russo was already here, earlier than expected, throwing their carefully laid plans into disarray. Beside him, Kane fidgeted with his earpiece, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the tiny device. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold night air. "You sure about this?" His voice wavered, betraying the fear he was trying to hide beneath his practiced calm. Adrian kept his eye pressed to the scope, his breathing steady and controlled, just as he'd been trained. "Just stick to the plan." His words came out as a whisper, barely audible above the distant sound of waves lapping against the pier. Kane descended from their perch, making his way onto the docks with measured steps. His footsteps echoed across the concrete as he approached the gathering, maintaining the casual stride of a cop making his rounds. Adrian watched through his scope as Russo's men stiffened at Kane's approach, their hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons beneath their expensive jackets. Their faces were hard, suspicious, eyes darting between Kane and the shadows around them. One of them, a burly man with a scarred face that told stories of violence, stepped forward with a sneer. "Detective Kane, didn't think you'd show." The words dripped with barely concealed hostility, his hand resting deliberately on his hip. Kane lifted his shoulders in a casual shrug, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "I go where the money goes." He played his part well, but Adrian could see the slight tremor in his hands, the way his right foot tapped nervously against the concrete. The crunch of tires on gravel drew everyone's attention. A second vehicle, another black sedan, pulled into view, its engine purring softly in the night air. The headlights cut through the darkness before dying, plunging the scene back into shadow. The driver's door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo across the water. Through his scope, Adrian watched as a familiar figure emerged from the car. His finger froze on the trigger, his breath catching in his throat, his heart pounding against his ribs. Chief Frank Holloway stepped into the harsh dock lighting, his police badge gleaming on his belt like a mockery of everything it was supposed to represent. Adrian felt his stomach turn to ice, a cold wave of betrayal washing over him. His own boss, the man he'd reported to for years, the one who'd shaken his hand and praised his dedication, was here making deals with Danny Russo. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. All those dead-end investigations, all those cases that mysteriously went cold, all the evidence that seemed to vanish overnight. Holloway had been Russo's man all along, pulling strings from the shadows of his office. He exhaled sharply, watching his world tilt on its axis. Everything he thought he knew crumbling around him. This wasn't just about catching a corrupt cop anymore. The rot went straight to the top of the department, poisoning everything it touched. Through his earpiece, Adrian listened as footsteps crunched across the concrete, each step echoing in the still night air. Chief Holloway's confident stride carried him directly to Russo, their handshake illuminated under the harsh dock lights that cast long, menacing shadows across the ground. "This is the last deal, Russo. After tonight, we're done." Holloway's voice crackled through the audio feed, carrying that same authoritative tone he used in department meetings, though now it held an edge of strain beneath the surface. Russo's laugh was soft, almost gentle, but filled with dark amusement that made Adrian's skin crawl. "You and I both know that's a lie." His words dripped with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards, each syllable a reminder of his iron grip on the city. Adrian's grip tightened on his weapon, his knuckles white against the cold metal as sweat dampened his palms. The sight of his chief standing there, dealing with the city's most notorious criminal, made his stomach churn with a mix of rage and betrayal. Years of unexplained case closures, evidence that vanished overnight, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories. It all made terrible sense now, fitting together like pieces of a grotesque puzzle. Hunter, who had been lying silently beside him on the rooftop, suddenly raised his head, ears twitching in that way Adrian had learned to trust. The dog's muscles tensed beneath his fur, and something in his posture screamed danger. Something was wrong. Below, Cain shifted his weight, the movement subtle but deliberate, like a predator preparing to strike. His head turned slightly, eyes lifting toward the rooftop where Adrian lay hidden in the shadows, and the detective's blood ran cold. A small smile played across Cain's face, cruel and knowing. "Cole's watching us right now, isn't he?" The words hit Adrian like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. His heart stopped, then started hammering against his ribs with bruising force. Cain had played him perfectly, drawing him out, setting him up like a mark in an elaborate con game. The crack of a rifle shot split the night air, shattering the false calm. Adrian rolled hard to his left, feeling the wind of the bullet as it passed where his head had been moments before, close enough that he could almost feel its deadly heat. The round slammed into the metal ventilation unit behind him, the impact echoing across the rooftop like a thunderclap in the suddenly chaotic night. They'd known. All along, they'd known he would be here. Cain's information, his apparent willingness to help, the breadcrumb trail of evidence. It had all been bait in an elaborate trap designed to draw him out into the open. And now they had him in their crosshairs, a target served up on a silver platter of his own making. Adrian's boots pounded against the rooftop as he ran, each step sending jolts through his legs and echoing off the surrounding buildings. Hunter matched his pace perfectly, the dog's powerful muscles propelling him forward with fluid grace, his ears pinned back against the wind. Behind them, bullets sparked off metal and concrete, the sound of gunfire echoing across the docks like angry thunderclaps in the cold night air. "Find Cole!" Russo's voice carried from below, filled with cold fury that sent chills down Adrian's spine. "I want him dead. Don't come back until you have his body." Holloway's commands joined the chaos, his familiar authoritative tone now twisted with desperation and underlying fear. "Cover the exits. Don't let him get away. Check every corner, every shadow." Adrian's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, scanning his surroundings for options, his breath coming in ragged gasps that formed white clouds in the frigid air. The edge of the roof was coming up fast, too fast. Behind him, footsteps clattered on the metal stairs, the sound growing louder with each passing second. They were closing in, their heavy boots thundering against the steps. Without slowing down, Adrian launched himself across the gap between buildings, his coat billowing around him like dark wings. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne, the dark water of the harbor visible far below, glinting dimly in the moonlight. He landed hard on a shipping container, rolling to absorb the impact, his shoulder protesting against the cold metal. Hunter sailed through the air beside him, landing with practiced ease, his claws finding purchase on the slippery surface. A bullet whizzed past Adrian's ear, so close he felt the displacement of air and heard the sharp crack of its passage. He scrambled to his feet, keeping low, his hands scraping against the rough surface. The container's metal surface was slick with snow and sea spray, making each step treacherous as ice crystals crunched beneath his feet. Through the maze of stacked containers, movement caught his eye. A massive loading crane, its arms swinging slowly as it repositioned cargo. The yellow warning lights casting eerie shadows across the dockyard. The platform at its base was still operational, lights blinking on its control panel like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Adrian's heart pounded against his ribs as he made his choice, the desperate plan forming in his mind. It was insane, but it was their only shot at survival. "Come on, boy," he called to Hunter, sprinting toward the crane, his voice hoarse from exertion. The dog stayed right with him, understanding in his intelligent eyes, complete trust evident in every movement. More bullets peppered the ground around them, sending sparks flying in the darkness and leaving smoking divots in the concrete. Adrian reached the crane's platform and grabbed Hunter, pulling the dog close against his chest, feeling the animal's rapid heartbeat match his own. The animal trusted him completely, remaining still despite the chaos around them, his warm breath steady against Adrian's neck. With his free arm, Adrian seized the platform's railing just as it began to rise, the cold metal biting into his palm. Bullets tore through the air where they had been standing seconds before, the sharp reports of gunfire echoing off the warehouse walls. The platform swung out over the dark water, carrying them away from the gunfire, creaking and swaying in the bitter wind. Through the metal grating, Adrian could see Russo standing on the dock, his face contorted with rage as he watched his prey escape, his expensive coat flapping in the harbor breeze. The criminal kingpin's expression burned itself into Adrian's memory, a mask of pure hatred and promised vengeance that would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop anymore. This wasn't just about evidence or arrests. As the crane carried them over the harbor's black waters, Adrian knew with bone-deep certainty that this had become something much more dangerous, something that would change both their lives forever. This was war, and there would be no going back. Adrian and Hunter crashed onto the dock, the impact jarring their bones. The metal crane platform swung away above them, creaking in the winter wind. Before they could catch their breath, bullets sparked off the concrete around them, the sound of gunfire shattering the night. Hunter lunged forward, but suddenly yelped in pain. A bullet had grazed his back leg, leaving a streak of red across his golden-brown fur. Adrian's heart seized at the sound of Hunter's pain, his stomach twisting into knots. But there was no time to stop. Russo's men were closing in, their boots thundering against the dock. "Keep moving!" Adrian shouted, his voice raw. He pulled his gun and returned fire, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkness. Two of Russo's men dove behind cargo containers, cursing as Adrian's bullets pinged off metal near their heads. But more were coming. He counted at least 6 figures moving through the shadows, and probably more he couldn't see. Through the chaos, Adrian spotted a narrow gap between 2 shipping containers, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was their only shot at escape. He turned to call Hunter, but his heart sank as he saw the dog struggling to move, leaving crimson droplets in the fresh snow. "Damn it," Adrian muttered, holstering his weapon. Without hesitation, he sprinted back to Hunter, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past his head. He could feel the heat of one pass so close it nearly singed his ear. Adrian wrapped his arms around Hunter's body, lifting the heavy dog with a grunt. Hunter wasn't making it easy. He growled and pushed against Adrian's chest, trying to break free. His eyes were locked on their attackers, his protective instincts overwhelming his pain. Even injured, he wanted to fight, to stand between Adrian and danger. "Not today, boy," Adrian grunted, dragging them both behind the nearest container. "I'm not losing you." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They were running out of time. Adrian reached for his belt with one hand, his other arm still holding Hunter close. His fingers found the cold metal of the emergency flare. He pulled it free, aimed at the sky, and fired. The flare shot upward with a sharp hiss, bursting into brilliant red light that illuminated the entire dock. It was a desperate call for help, a signal to the few people left in the department he still trusted. The flare painted the snow crimson as it drifted slowly downward, casting long shadows across the concrete. Hunter finally stopped struggling, pressing close to Adrian's side as they watched it fall. The dank air of the abandoned subway tunnel pressed around them as Adrian carefully lowered Hunter onto the cold concrete floor. His hands were slick with the dog's blood, making his stomach twist with worry. The metallic smell of it filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it needed attention soon. "Easy, boy," Adrian whispered, his voice echoing softly off the curved walls. The sound of water dripping in the distance created an eerie rhythm in the darkness. He stripped off his jacket and tore a long strip from his shirt, the fabric ripping with a sharp sound that made Hunter's ears twitch. The dog lay still, watching Adrian with trusting eyes as he gently wrapped the makeshift bandage around the injured leg, his fingers working carefully to avoid causing more pain. Hunter let out a small whimper, but remained brave, only flinching slightly as Adrian tied off the bandage. His breath came in shallow pants, but his eyes never left Adrian's face. "We're getting out of this," Adrian murmured, running a hand through Hunter's fur, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath his palm. "I promise." The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, water dripping somewhere in the darkness. The musty smell of decay and abandonment hung heavy in the air. Adrian pulled out his phone, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows on his face and illuminating the graffiti-covered walls around them. No bars. No way to call for backup. Not that he had many allies left in the department anyway. Most had either been bought off or scared into silence by Russo's influence. His thumb hovered over the keypad, a slight tremor in his hand betraying his inner conflict. There was one number he'd sworn he'd never dial, belonging to a man he'd rather forget. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Hunter's life was worth more than his pride. Adrian punched in the digits he'd memorized years ago, just in case. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered, thick with amusement. "Didn't think I'd hear from you, Cole." Adrian's jaw clenched so tight it hurt, his free hand balling into a fist. "I need a favor, Vance." Vance Calloway, the man Adrian had personally put behind bars 5 years ago. Now he was living comfortably off his ill-gotten gains, having served a reduced sentence for cooperation. The memory of that deal still left a bitter taste in Adrian's mouth. He hated everything the man stood for. But right now, he needed Vance's particular brand of influence. After all, no one in the city hated Danny Russo more than Vance did, and that hatred might just be enough to save them both. "Meet me in 1 hour, alone." Vance's voice carried a hint of satisfaction at having Adrian Cole, of all people, asking for help. Adrian looked down at Hunter, who wagged his tail weakly, despite the pain. The loyal dog's unwavering trust made his chest tighten with emotion. "I don't have another choice, do I?" Hunter's tail thumped against the ground again, as if trying to reassure his partner that everything would be okay. The sound echoed through the tunnel, a steady rhythm of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. Adrian's car rolled to a stop outside the Golden Room, its neon sign casting a sickly yellow glow across the snow-covered sidewalk. Ice crystals sparkled in the artificial light, creating an almost magical effect that belied the dangerous business conducted within. The club stood like a fortress of luxury in the city's wealthiest district, its marble facade and gold-trimmed windows a stark contrast to the gritty streets he usually patrolled. Even from outside, the air of exclusivity was palpable. 2 burly men in dark suits flanked the entrance, their eyes following Adrian as he approached. Their hands rested casually near their jackets, where Adrian knew they carried high-end firearms. He showed them his badge, and they exchanged knowing looks before stepping aside. The heavy doors opened to reveal a world of crystal chandeliers, plush velvet, and the distinct smell of expensive cigars mingled with designer perfumes. The main room hummed with quiet conversation and soft jazz floating from a trio in the corner. Well-dressed figures huddled in private booths, conducting business over glasses of aged whiskey and elaborate cocktails. Adrian spotted 3 known drug dealers, a money launderer, and at least 2 hitmen, all of them pretending to be legitimate businessmen in their tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. Vance Calloway sat at a corner table on an elevated platform, giving him a clear view of the entire club. 4 bodyguards surrounded him, their hands never far from their concealed weapons, eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. Time hadn't been kind to Vance. His hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines marked his face like a map of hard-won experience. But his eyes remained sharp and calculating beneath heavy lids. "Detective Cole," Vance called out, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Drink?" "It's the good stuff. 30-year-old single malt." Adrian sat down, declining the offered whiskey with a shake of his head. His throat felt dry, but he needed to keep his wits about him. "I need your help taking down Russo." Vance's eyebrows rose slightly as Adrian outlined his plan. It was bold, perhaps even suicide, setting up a fake weapons deal, using Vance's connections to make it look legitimate, then catching Russo and his corrupt cops in the act. The slightest miscalculation, the smallest slip in timing, would mean certain death for everyone involved. "You always were reckless, Cole," Vance said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The ice clinked against the crystal tumbler like tiny warning bells. "That's why you liked me," Adrian replied, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was proposing. A smirk played across Vance's weathered face, a glimpse of the dangerous man he used to be. "Fine, I'll help. But if you screw this up, don't expect me to save you. Russo isn't known for his mercy." They shook hands across the table, sealing the deal with a firm grip that spoke of mutual understanding and respect. The die was cast, and Adrian knew there would be no turning back now. The abandoned warehouse loomed like a steel giant against the night sky, its broken windows reflecting the approaching headlights of Russo's convoy. Rust-streaked walls rose into darkness, and the bitter winter wind whistled through gaps in the corrugated metal. Inside, Adrian stood in position, his breath steady despite the tension coursing through his body. Hunter pressed against his leg, fur bristling, every muscle coiled and ready for what was coming. The dog's warm presence was reassuring in the biting cold of the empty building. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the empty space, followed by muffled voices and crunching footsteps on frozen gravel. Adrian's fingers tightened around his gun, the metal cool and familiar against his palm. Months of investigation, countless sleepless nights, and too many close calls had led to this moment. "One way or another, this ends tonight," he muttered, more to himself than to Hunter. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the crunch of expensive leather shoes on broken concrete. The warehouse door groaned open on protesting hinges, and Danny Russo strode in like he owned the place, his long black coat swaying with each confident step. 4 of his best men flanked him, their weapons visible beneath expensive suits tailored to hide shoulder holsters. Russo's face held that same smug confidence it always did, but there was something else there too, a hint of annoyance, maybe even respect, pulling at the corners of his mouth. "I'll admit, Cole, you've been a pain in my ass," Russo said, his voice echoing off the metal walls, filling the cavernous space with his characteristic arrogance. Adrian couldn't help but smirk, tasting the satisfaction of having finally cornered his prey. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." The warehouse plunged into darkness as someone cut the power. The sudden black was absolute, disorienting, broken only by thin strips of moonlight filtering through the highest windows. Then came the sound of boots on metal catwalks, and all hell broke loose. Vance's men emerged from their hiding spots like shadows coming to life, their movements precise and practiced. Gunfire exploded across the warehouse, muzzle flashes illuminating faces in stark bursts of light, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Adrian moved fast, Hunter right beside him, the dog's nails clicking against concrete. They weaved through the chaos, past screaming men and flying bullets, using years of tactical training to anticipate where shots would land. Through the strobing gunfire, Adrian caught glimpses of the fight. Russo's men taking cover behind wooden crates, Vance's team pressing their advantage from elevated positions, bodies falling on both sides as the air filled with cordite and shouts. Then he spotted it, Russo's silhouette slipping toward a side exit, trying to escape in the confusion, like the coward he truly was. Not this time. Adrian sprinted after him, Hunter keeping pace despite his injured leg, the dog's determination matching his own. They burst out into the cold night air, their breath forming clouds in the freezing temperature. Adrian launched himself forward, tackling Russo onto the ice-covered pavement. They rolled across the frozen ground, trading punches fueled by years of built-up hatred and frustration. Russo's fist caught Adrian's jaw with a crack that sent stars across his vision. Adrian drove his knee into Russo's ribs, feeling something give beneath the expensive wool coat. Hunter, moving with fierce determination despite his wound, leapt into the fray with a low growl. His powerful jaws clamped down on Russo's arm, pinning him to the ground with unwavering force. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second, their blue and red lights starting to paint the warehouse walls in alternating colors. The icy pavement bit into Russo's expensive Italian suit as Hunter's powerful jaws kept him pinned, the dog's grip unwavering despite the bleeding gash across his shoulder. Blood trickled down Adrian's forehead in thin crimson lines, the deep cut stinging sharply in the bitter cold as he pressed his knee firmly against Russo's back, feeling the crime boss's labored breathing. His own breath came in heavy clouds in the frigid air, muscles screaming from the brutal fight that had led them here. "Game over," Adrian muttered through clenched teeth, roughly pulling Russo's arms behind his back. The crime boss grunted in pain, but didn't resist, his usual smugness replaced by cold fury. The piercing wail of approaching sirens grew steadily louder, cutting through the still night air like a knife. Red and blue lights painted the warehouse walls in alternating colors as the first patrol cars screeched to a halt in the parking lot, tires crunching on the frozen ground. Adrian's grip tightened on Russo, his eyes narrowing as officers began pouring out of their vehicles, weapons drawn. He couldn't trust any of them, not yet. Not after everything he'd uncovered. "You touch him, and I swear I'll bury you with him," Adrian shouted at the approaching officers, his voice carrying clear warning across the lot. The officers hesitated, hands hovering near their weapons, uncertain expressions crossing their faces in the strobing lights. Then Detective Marcus Kane emerged from the lead car, his weathered face illuminated by the flashing lights. He locked eyes with Adrian across the parking lot, his expression unreadable, but somehow different from the mask he usually wore. Time seemed to slow as Kane walked forward with measured steps, metal handcuffs glinting in his hand like a promise. Without a word, Kane knelt beside Russo and snapped the cuffs around his wrists, the sharp click echoing in the tense silence. The simple action spoke volumes. Kane had finally chosen his side after years of walking the line. Russo twisted his head to glare up at Adrian, his eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to radiate heat in the freezing air. "You really think this ends with me?" His voice dripped with venom, lips curled in a snarl. "There will always be another guy like me, and another, and another." Adrian tightened his grip on Russo's shoulder, pressing him harder against the frozen ground until the man winced. "Then I'll take them down too. Every last one of them." Two officers moved forward to help Kane lift Russo to his feet, their movements cautious and precise. They marched him toward the waiting cruiser, his expensive shoes scraping across the ice-covered pavement, leaving dark scuff marks in their wake. Adrian watched as they loaded him into the back seat, the door slamming with a heavy finality that seemed to mark the end of an era. Looking down at Hunter, Adrian saw bone-deep exhaustion in the dog's stance, but his tail wagged steadily, those intelligent eyes still bright with loyalty. Despite his wound, despite everything they'd been through in the past weeks, Hunter's spirit remained unbroken, just like his own. "You did good, partner," Adrian murmured softly, reaching down to run his fingers through Hunter's thick fur, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to take a deep, unrestricted breath, tasting victory in the cold night air. A week after Russo's arrest, Adrian stood in the chief's office, thumbing through a thick stack of case files that documented years of corruption. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Each file told a story of betrayal, officers who had sold their badges for quick cash, evidence that had conveniently disappeared, cases that had been buried. Kane sat across from him in one of the leather chairs, his tie loosened and dark circles under his eyes from endless hours of internal investigations. "Half the city wants you dead, Cole. The other half wants to give you a medal." Adrian looked up from the files and smirked. "I'll take a vacation instead." His fingers absently traced the edge of a particularly damning report about Chief Holloway's involvement. The Russo case dominated every news channel and newspaper headline. "Police corruption exposed," screamed the front pages, accompanied by photos of officers being led away in handcuffs. Each day brought new revelations, peeling back layers of corruption that had infected the department like a disease. Chief Holloway's resignation came first, announced at a tense press conference where he could barely meet the camera's gaze. His statement was brief, his voice strained as he admitted to errors in judgment, a weak euphemism for years of taking bribes and protecting criminals. In the grand jury room, Adrian and Kane spent hours testifying, methodically laying out evidence that would ensure Russo and his corrupt allies face justice. Hunter sat beside Adrian throughout the proceedings, his presence steady and reassuring. The dog's watchful eyes tracked every movement in the courtroom, as if he understood the gravity of their testimony. When questioned about Hunter's role in the investigation, Adrian detailed how the dog had led him to the warehouse that first night, how he'd helped track down evidence, and how he'd saved Adrian's life more than once. The jury members nodded, some even smiled at Hunter, who maintained his professional demeanor despite the attention. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters descended on Adrian, microphones thrust toward his face, cameras flashing. They shouted questions about corruption, about Russo, about the future of the department. Adrian simply reached down to pat Hunter's head, the dog's fur soft under his palm. "We did our job," he stated simply, then turned and walked away from the chaos, Hunter padding faithfully by his side. Days later, Adrian sat cross-legged on his apartment floor, the evening sun casting long shadows through the windows. The tennis ball in his hand was well worn, covered in teeth marks from countless throws. He tossed it across the room, watching as Hunter leapt up with surprising agility despite his recent injury, snatching the ball mid-flight. The dog's tail wagged with pure joy as he bounded back, dropping the slobbery ball in Adrian's lap. The simple routine felt oddly therapeutic. The bruises from his fight with Russo had faded to yellow-green patches, barely visible now. But the weight of the case, the betrayals, the corruption, the violence, still hung in the air like a lingering shadow. Hunter nudged the ball with his nose, eager for another throw. Adrian obliged, sending it bouncing off the far wall. As he watched Hunter chase after it, something shifted in his chest. A realization that had been slowly building over the past weeks finally crystallized. He wasn't alone anymore. After years of keeping everyone at arm's length, of trusting no one, he had found an unlikely partner in this former stray. A knock at the door interrupted their game. Kane stood in the hallway, looking more relaxed than Adrian had seen him in weeks. Without a word, he walked in and tossed a sealed envelope onto Adrian's coffee table. Adrian eyed the official department seal. "What's this?" Kane shrugged, hands in his pockets. "Official offer. They want you to head internal affairs. Clean house from the inside." Adrian exhaled slowly, staring at the envelope as if it might bite. The position would give him real power to root out corruption, to prevent another Russo from poisoning the department. Hell of a job offer. "Yeah," Kane said, watching as Hunter padded over to sniff his shoes. "But you already got a partner." He nodded at the dog, who had settled protectively near Adrian's feet. Adrian smirked, reaching down to scratch behind Hunter's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, eyes half closed in contentment. "Yeah," Adrian murmured softly. "I do." He looked at the envelope again, then deliberately set it aside, leaving it unopened. For the first time in a long time, he felt no rush to make a decision. Right now, this moment, playing fetch with his dog in his quiet apartment, felt more important than any promotion. 1 month after the Russo case, Adrian walked through the city streets with Hunter at his side, fresh snow falling in gentle flakes around them. The evening air held a peaceful stillness that seemed almost foreign after weeks of chaos and danger. Street lamps cast warm circles of light on the untouched snow, and their footprints left matching tracks, man and dog side by side. Hunter suddenly paused, his ears perking up as he turned toward a narrow alleyway. His nose twitched as he sampled the cold air, tail going still with focus. Adrian couldn't help but chuckle at his partner's investigative stance. "What, you find another case already?" he asked, only half joking. After all, their partnership had started exactly like this, with Hunter leading him to evidence that broke open the biggest case of his career. As they stood there, a faint sound drifted from the alley, soft, pitiful whimpering that made Hunter's ears twitch. Adrian followed as his dog padded carefully into the shadows, leading him toward a rusty dumpster. There, huddled against the cold metal, was a tiny puppy. It shivered violently, its thin coat offering little protection against the winter chill. Adrian stood motionless for a moment, taking in the scene. Some things never changed in this city. There would always be those who needed help, always another story waiting in the shadows. But something had changed in him. Where he once might have walked past, hardened by years of seeing the worst in people, he now saw an opportunity to help. Hunter approached the puppy with surprising gentleness, sniffing it carefully before turning back to Adrian. His eyes seemed to hold a question, or maybe a reminder of that snowy night when Adrian had opened his own door to a stray. Adrian let out a resigned sigh, already shrugging off his warm jacket. He knelt down and carefully wrapped it around the trembling pup, which immediately tried to burrow deeper into the sudden warmth. "Come on," he muttered, gathering the bundle into his arms. "Let's get you inside." Hunter fell into step beside him, tail wagging happily as they made their way home through the gently falling snow. The story had begun with a stray dog in the snow, and now it was ending the same way. Only this time, Adrian was the one opening the door. If you enjoyed this story, I handpicked the next one just for you. Don't miss it. Click here to watch it.